The palace sparkled as though the stars themselves had descended to dance along the marble floors. Crystal chandeliers scattered light like scattered diamonds, illuminating gowns of silk and velvet that shimmered with every turn. 100 princesses moved through the hall with practiced grace, their laughter tinkling over the notes of the orchestra, each vying to capture the Alpha King's attention. Every smile, every curtsy, every calculated glance was aimed to enchant, to impress, to win. And yet, in the shadows, a smaller figure moved with quiet determination. Ilara carried her tray with trembling hands, careful not to spill the wine that could easily betray her status. Her dress was plain, her hair tied back simply, and the nobles barely spared her a glance. She was invisible, meant to remain unseen. But her heart thumped in her chest as if it knew she was being watched, though she could not guess by whom. A tray tilted. A goblet wobbled. In one clumsy motion, crimson wine tipped over the edge, spilling across her fingers and dripping onto the floor. Gasps rippled through the room, and a group of princesses nearby tittered, their eyes sharp with cruelty. "Clumsy maid," one whispered, voice edged with mockery. "Can't even carry a tray properly," another sneered. Ilara's cheeks flamed, and for a heartbeat she wished she could vanish into the shadows. Her hands shook as she righted the tray, whispering silent apologies to no one in particular. The nobles laughed quietly among themselves, their amusement a blade that cut deeper than the spilled wine. She bowed slightly, hiding her shame, and hurried past, her mind racing, her chest tight with humiliation. And yet, even in the chaos, a pair of eyes followed her. Kaelan, the Alpha King, stood near the edge of the grand hall, his expression calm, composed, but unyielding. His gaze was sharp, unwavering, and wholly focused on her. The other princesses twirled and flaunted, their charms and jewels dazzling the crowd, but he saw none of them. Only her. He noticed the small, quiet grace in the way she steadied the tray, the way her shoulders straightened even under the weight of embarrassment. There was a dignity in her struggle, a courage that required no fanfare. Where the others performed, she endured. Where they schemed, she simply existed, and it captivated him. A jewel-toned gown brushed past her elbow, and a careless laugh nearly sent another tray tumbling. Kaelan's hand moved slightly, almost imperceptibly, as if guiding fate itself. The tray steadied, the moment passed, and Ilara never knew that she had just been saved. His intervention was silent, invisible, yet deliberate. She remained unaware, but he watched, memorizing every tremor of her hands, every quiet inhale of breath, every flicker of her expressive brown eyes. The princesses continued their flamboyant displays, curtsying with precision, flaunting their beauty with a practiced charm that demanded attention. Yet in Kaelan's eyes, none of it mattered. He saw only Ilara, the humble, unnoticed maid who carried herself with a resilience and gentleness that drew him closer, though he did not move, though he remained a shadow in the corner of the grand hall. Ilara set down the tray at a nearby table, fingers trembling slightly as she wiped the stray drops of wine from her dress. She glanced around, hoping to catch a friendly face, someone who would understand her struggle, but saw nothing but judgment and laughter. Her lips parted in a small, defeated sigh, her body taut with tension. And still, she moved on. Unseen by her, Kaelan's eyes softened, a faint, private acknowledgement of her courage. He did not yet step forward, did not yet break the distance, but in his stillness, protection flowed like a silent river. Every slight hazard, every whispered insult, every careless step she might take, he was already aware, already guarding, already watching. The music swelled as the princesses' laughter rose in triumphant harmony. Ilara moved again, carrying the last tray of the evening, her small figure swallowed by the opulence of the ballroom. No one noticed the way her fingers brushed against a gilded chair, the way she paused for a brief, whispered breath of relief. No one, except him. Kaelan's presence was a quiet storm behind her, unseen yet undeniable. And as the first chords of the evening's dance began, he knew with absolute certainty that she was the only one he would ever truly see. Her heart, unaware of his attention, continued its quiet struggle, each step heavy with the weight of expectation, humiliation, and an almost unspoken longing. Yet even in her invisibility, she had captured the gaze of the Alpha King. And that gaze, patient and unwavering, would change everything. Word count. 820. Emotional focus, empathy, injustice, Intrigue, slow burn tension. Ending hook. Kaelan watches silently, foreshadowing his protection and attention while Alara remains unaware, creating intrigue for the next chapter. If you want, I can immediately continue with Chapter 2. A glimpse beyond the mask, fully expanded in the same storytelling, AI voiceover ready style. Do you want me to proceed with that next? Right, next chapter. Absolutely. Let's continue seamlessly into Chapter 2, A Glimpse Beyond the Mask. This will pick up from the tension of Chapter 1 and expand the slow burn intrigue and emotional connection between Kaelan and Alara. The music shifted, softer now, a gentle waltz that rippled across the polished floor. Alara moved cautiously, balancing a tray of sparkling glasses as she navigated between clusters of dancing nobles. The heat of embarrassment from earlier still lingered in her cheeks, and yet, she forced herself to hold her head high. Every step was measured, every gesture careful, as though the world demanded she prove she belonged, even though she knew she did not. From his vantage at the far side of the ballroom, Kaelan's gaze followed her every move. He did not need to approach, for proximity alone could destroy the fragile piece she clung to. Instead, he watched her like a guardian unseen, noting the way she straightened a tray wobbling in the hands of a nervous footman, or the tiny hesitation before she answered a passing noble's abrupt query. No one else noticed these small moments, the fleeting gestures of patience, the quiet strength that seemed to flow from her very bones. To everyone else, she was simply a maid, a shadow flitting across the room. To him, she was remarkable. A princess passed, her gown glinting like molten gold under the chandeliers. She laughed with practiced charm, her eyes searching for Kaelan, seeking his approval. Kaelan allowed himself a faint frown. There was skill in performance, he knew, yet it was hollow. None of them had the gravity he sensed in Alara, the way she moved despite fear, despite ridicule. There was truth in her gestures. Alara paused briefly near the center of the ballroom, placing the glasses down on a low table. She stole a glance at the dancers, noticing the way their laughter rang sharp and artificial. Her gaze faltered as a flash of movement caught her eye, a figure standing in shadow, observing her with unwavering intensity. Her breath caught, though she did not understand why. For a single heartbeat, she thought perhaps it was a noble's inspection, or the stern gaze of a guard. And yet, when her eyes met his, Kaelan's eyes, there was something entirely different. They held her for a moment longer than politeness dictated, calm, steady, and entirely consuming. A flicker of warmth ran through her chest, unfamiliar and unsteady, as though a quiet current had touched her soul. A tray clinked near her, jolting her from the gaze, and the moment passed. She shook her head, dismissing it as imagination. But her pulse had quickened. Something unspoken lingered, a whisper of recognition she could not yet name. And Kaelan, still in the shadows, allowed himself the smallest of smiles. He did not step forward. He did not intrude. Yet he would not look away. The princesses continued their display, twirling and curtsying, their laughter cutting like fine knives through the hum of the room. One particularly bold princess approached the edge of the dance floor, her eyes sweeping the hall, searching for Kaelan. He did not glance at her. His attention remained fixed on the quiet figure moving with care and resilience. Alara moved again, serving the nobles near the music ensemble. She heard snippets of conversation, careless words that pricked her like thorns. Such a simple girl, one whispered. Not worthy to be in his presence. Her lips pressed together, and she averted her gaze. And yet, beneath the sting of humiliation, a strange awareness lingered. Someone powerful had noticed her, not for her beauty, not for her cunning, but for the strength she herself barely understood. Kaelan's presence was silent yet unmistakable. Each movement she made, he observed with precision. The way her fingers flexed as she steadied a glass, the slight lift of her chin when a noble's remark cut too close, the careful step backward to avoid spilling her load. Every subtle act drew him closer, not physically, but in attention and regard. She moved past the grand staircase, nearly brushing against a gilded railing. A slip was imminent, the polished floor betraying her cautious steps. Before she could falter, Kaelan's presence nudged the air around her as if he had shifted the current itself. Her foot found purchase, her balance righted, and she continued, unaware of the near disaster. Her heart raced in response to a feeling she could not explain. Curiosity, perhaps, or the echo of some unspoken connection that reached across the crowded ballroom. Her eyes flicked toward the shadowed corner where he had stood, and though he had vanished from her sight, the sense of being watched remained. She shivered, not from fear, but from a subtle, stirring awareness that someone extraordinary had taken note of her. And Kaelan, from his unseen position, allowed himself a quiet thought. She was unlike any who had come before her, and he would not let her go unnoticed. The music swelled again, rising into a melody that promised both celebration and subtle tension. Ilara carried on, her movements careful, her mind alive with questions she did not yet dare voice. In the quiet space between her steps, a bond began to form, a fragile, unspoken tether between the humble maid and the Alpha King who had already claimed her attention, though the world remained unaware. The candles along the grand hall flickered, casting soft shadows across the marble floors and gilded walls. Ilara moved quietly among the clusters of nobles, a tray balanced carefully in her hands. The weight of each goblet felt heavier than it should, as if the whispered words around her added invisible burden to her shoulders. She caught fragments of conversation, careless and cutting. Did you see her stumble earlier? How clumsy. She's no one, barely a servant. How dare she breathe the same air as us? They say the Alpha King hardly even noticed her, yet she lingers as if she belongs. Ilara's breath hitched. Each word pressed against her chest, 1,000 tiny cuts that no one outside her own heart could feel. She lowered her gaze to the tray, her hands trembling slightly, and pressed forward. She wanted to disappear, to dissolve into the shadows and vanish completely, yet the music and the rhythm of the ballroom carried her forward whether she wished it or not. And then, from across the hall, a subtle shift in the air drew her attention, a presence she could not place. Kaelan stood near a tall marble column, dark and still, his posture calm yet magnetic. His eyes traced her movements, taking in each delicate adjustment of her stance, every careful step she made to avoid disaster. He did not approach, did not intrude, but his focus was absolute. It was a quiet defiance against the cruelty surrounding her, a promise without words. Ilara felt it, though she could not understand it. A fleeting warmth ran through her chest, subtle and confusing, as if someone had seen the truth of her in the midst of the laughter and judgment. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the feeling. It was impossible, he could not have noticed her, not truly. She was nothing, a mere shadow at the edge of the grand ballroom. Yet even as she tried to convince herself, her ears caught more whispered malice. A rival princess had leaned close to a cluster of courtiers, her voice silk and poison intertwined. "Mark my words," she said, a sly smile curling her lips. "No matter how unnoticed she seems, someone powerful is already watching. But what is a maid to a king? She cannot hold her place." Ilara's hands tightened on the tray. Her heart thumped unevenly, a mix of fear, confusion, and something she had no name for. She wanted to retreat, to sink into the folds of her simple dress and vanish from the judgmental eyes, yet her feet refused to obey the impulse. Somehow, she was still moving forward. Somehow, she was still enduring. Kaelan's gaze followed her unwaveringly, noting the way her chest rose and fell in measured breaths, the small tremor of her fingers as she steadied the tray, the way her lips pressed together as though forcing herself to remain composed. Each subtle gesture spoke to him louder than any words could. She bore the whispers, the sneers, the casual cruelty, and she did so without complaint, without demand, without recognition. A noblewoman brushed past her, too distracted by her own reflection to notice Ilara's presence. The tray shifted precariously, and for a brief, terrifying second, Ilara thought it would tip. A faint surge of air, imperceptible, steadied the glasses. She looked around, startled, but no one was near. Her pulse quickened. It was as if someone unseen had intervened, a silent hand guiding her through the peril. Kaelan allowed a small, private smile. She did not yet know it was him, did not yet know he had already begun the quiet work of protecting her. The princesses flitted by, oblivious to the silent bond forming in the spaces they could not see. Their schemes, their laughter, their rivalries, none of it touched him. Only her mattered, only her endurance, her unspoken courage. As she moved to set down the tray, Kaelan's eyes softened, tracing the delicate line of her jaw, the way her fingers lingered on the edge of the table before releasing it. A whispered breath, a subtle tilt of the head, these were the moments that defined her, and he memorized each one. And somewhere deep in her chest, beneath the sting of ridicule and the ache of invisibility, a small spark flickered. Perhaps it was curiosity, or perhaps it was something more. She felt, fleetingly, that someone powerful was aware of her, not her station, not her mistakes, but her very self. And though she could not yet name him, nor trust the stirring in her chest, she sensed a presence that was patient, deliberate, and undeniable. The music swelled again, carrying laughter and light across the hall, but for Ilara, the world had shifted imperceptibly. In the shadows, someone watched. Someone cared. And for the first time that evening, she allowed herself a trembling thought. Maybe she was not entirely invisible after all. The grand hall shimmered with candlelight and crystal, but the shadows always lingered in corners where the music softened and voices fell into murmurs. Ilara moved carefully between clusters of dancing nobles, a tray of wine balanced in her hands. Her palms were slick with nerves, though she kept her chin high, forcing her shoulders to remain straight. Every eye she passed seemed to glance through her, or worse, glance down on her. A princess spun past, a whirlwind of silk and laughter, nearly colliding with her. Ilara's breath caught, her tray tipping slightly. A few glasses rattled, threatening to tumble. The court froze, even for a heartbeat, ready for the expected clumsy misstep. But the tray steadied, guided by a subtle shift of air she could not see, a force she could not name. Kaelan stood at a distance, almost invisible among the shadows near a towering column. His presence was still, commanding, and utterly quiet. Yet in every moment he watched, he guided, he protected. A gentle tilt here, an unseen nudge there, small, almost imperceptible gestures that saved her from harm without drawing attention. He did not intrude, did not call her out or make a show of his interference. That was not his way. His power was quiet, precise, and absolute. Ilara, unaware, moved forward, her pulse racing with a mixture of fear and determination. Each step was careful, deliberate, a dance in its own right. She caught snatches of conversation from passing nobles, whispers full of judgment and amusement. "Careful, Maid," one said under her breath, "or you'll ruin everything." She swallowed the lump in her throat and continued, pressing the tray closer to her chest as if it were armor against the world. Another mishap seemed inevitable, a wayward foot brushing her heel, the polished floor slick beneath her slippers, but again, she did not fall. Kaelan's attention never wavered, and though she could not see him, she felt a strange sense of safety. It was not comfort she understood, not yet, but a quiet tether, a presence that promised protection without words. The princesses twirled and curtsied in deliberate perfection, their laughter ringing like bells sharpened with ambition. One in particular glided past Ilara, her smile practiced, her eyes seeking Kaelan's approval. But he did not look at her. He had no interest in polished performance or empty beauty. His focus remained on the small figure moving cautiously through the room, the one no one else truly saw. Ilara reached the far side of the hall and paused to set the tray down. Her fingers lingered on the edge of the table, and she inhaled sharply, the weight of the room pressing against her. She felt exposed, fragile, almost foolish for daring to exist in such opulence. And yet, she could not deny the faint warmth she sensed, a subtle shift in the air as if someone unseen had acknowledged her perseverance. Kaelan's eyes softened as he observed her. Every tiny motion, the way her fingers flexed as she steadied the glasses, the careful tilt of her head to avoid a collision, the measured lift of her chin under scrutiny, was etched into his mind. He had seen many come and go, many who sought to impress him, but none like her. There was no artifice, no calculation, no desire for approval in her gestures. Only honesty and quiet strength. A servant jostled her from behind, almost causing another spill, but Ilara steadied herself, blinking rapidly as if to wipe away both the incident and the embarrassment. Kaelan's presence, unseen, shifted subtly, a silent promise that no harm would come to her, not from misstep, not from cruelty. He did not smile, did not speak, but his watchful gaze was a tether, invisible yet unbreakable. Ilara's pulse quickened. She could not name why, but she felt a strange sense of being seen. Not noticed in passing, not merely observed like a piece in a grand performance, but truly seen. And though she could not identify who or why, the sensation lingered, a quiet hope nestled beneath fear. The princesses continued their flamboyant displays, oblivious to the subtle bond forming in the spaces between music and whispers. Kaelan remained still, a shadow in the corner, his presence a silent shield. And Ilara, despite herself, moved forward with cautious grace, unaware that the Alpha King's eyes followed her every step, that every misstep she avoided was guided by hands unseen, and that the quiet protection surrounding her was only the beginning. The ballroom had grown brighter as more candles were lit, casting a golden glow over the swirling dancers. Music rolled like gentle waves across the polished floors, the melody light and intoxicating. The princesses moved with deliberate grace, their skirts a riot of silk and gemstones, each step and turn a calculated invitation for Kaelan's gaze. Ilara navigated the crowd with her tray, careful to keep balance and composure. Her hands trembled slightly, though she tried to steady them, and her heart beat a rapid rhythm that matched the waltz playing across the hall. She knew she was invisible, a mere shadow among the glittering gowns and polished smiles, yet every fiber of her being felt the weight of expectation, of eyes judging, of whispers following. A collision, a moment, fleeting but electric, shattered that fragile rhythm. As she reached to serve a glass, a figure brushed past her, their movement careless and swift. Her tray tipped, glasses teetered, and for the first time all night, fear surged through her chest. Then, in a heartbeat, a steadying hand brushed against hers, almost imperceptibly. A presence, calm and unwavering, shifted the tray just enough. Her pulse skipped. She looked up, startled, and her eyes met his, Kaelan's, dark and steady, catching hers for a fraction of a second. The world seemed to narrow around that moment. The music, the laughter, the twirling skirts, all of it faded to a quiet hum. His gaze held her as if she were the only thing in the room, a silent acknowledgement passing between them without a word. Electric, fleeting, and impossible to define. Her fingers still tingled from the brief contact, and her cheeks burned. Ilara quickly composed herself, setting the tray down with care, hoping her trembling had gone unnoticed. Yet she could not deny the strange flutter in her chest, the curious heat of being seen by someone she did not yet fully understand. She felt both exposed and strangely protected, as if the brush of his presence had stitched an invisible shield around her. Meanwhile, the princesses danced and preened, their movements exaggerated, their laughter ringing sharp and deliberate. One twirled near Kaelan, her gaze confident, her lips curved in a practiced smile, certain of her place at his side. But Kaelan did not look at her. His attention had already chosen someone else, someone who wore humility like armor, grace like instinct. Ilara moved again, threading through the crowded hall. A whispered insult brushed past her ear, aimed at her lowly status. A maid daring to touch the king's presence. Pathetic. She swallowed, her fingers tightening around the tray, and took a cautious step forward. She could feel eyes upon her, not all of them approving, yet none as commanding as the dark, hidden gaze she had glimpsed. The orchestra's melody swelled, calling a new dance to the floor. The princesses stepped forward, their skirts sweeping elegantly, their eyes glittering with ambition. Kaelan remained in the shadows, yet the way he moved, just a subtle shift of posture, a slight inclination of his head, guided her through the perils of the ballroom. Another close collision loomed, this time with a careless footman, and again, she found herself steadied by a presence she could not name, a force that seemed to anticipate her every falter. And then, a spark, a fleeting, accidental touch. She brushed past him once more as she served a glass, their hands colliding lightly, almost impossibly, for just a second longer than it should have been. Ilara froze, her pulse hammering. She felt it, a current of something unspoken, a quiet recognition that whispered across her nerves. Kaelan's eyes caught hers again, unwavering, his expression unreadable yet loaded with intent. For a heartbeat, the world seemed suspended. The laughter of nobles, the swirl of skirts, the glint of jewels, all faded beneath the weight of a silent acknowledgement. She had no words, no understanding, only the sudden, intense awareness of being noticed, truly noticed, and it terrified and thrilled her all at once. Kaelan retreated slightly into shadow, his presence still guarding, still guiding, his gaze lingering just long enough to remind her that she was no longer entirely alone in this glittering, dangerous court. The princesses continued their dance, oblivious to the subtle, electric connection forming between the maid and the king. Ilara's heart raced, a strange warmth threading through her chest. Something had shifted. Something in the way he had looked at her, touched her hands, and retreated with careful control told her she mattered, even if she did not yet understand how or why. She straightened, lifted her chin, and carried the tray forward once more, unaware that every careful step, every measured breath, every trembling finger was being watched, memorized, and silently cherished by the alpha who had already begun to claim not just her attention, but her place in his world. The hall had emptied slightly, the echo of laughter fading into the soft hum of candles and music that lingered in the corners. Kaelan stepped away from the ballroom, his long cloak brushing the polished marble as he moved toward the quiet sanctuary of his private chambers. The gold and crystal of the palace seemed distant here, replaced by shadowed walls and the faint scent of aged parchment and polished wood. He closed the door behind him and allowed himself the luxury of a slow exhale. The Alpha King's mask of composure, so meticulously maintained for the court, fell away, revealing the weight he carried beneath the crown. The ballroom, with its schemes, whispers, and glittering gowns, had been a stage, but here, in the solitude of his chambers, the truth pressed against his chest. He thought of her, Ilara, the quiet maid whose hands had trembled yet steadied every tray, whose eyes had burned with a combination of fear and resilience he could not ignore. She had moved among the princesses, invisible, belittled, yet somehow radiant in her humility. He remembered the faint brush of her fingers against his, the fleeting glance that had stolen his attention in a way no courtesan, no princess, could. Kaelan sank into a high-backed chair, the weight of his crown pressing on his shoulders like iron. He had spent years surrounded by loyalty bought with flattery, by smiles sharpened with ambition, by whispers that promised devotion in exchange for power. But none had touched him like she had, not with her beauty, not with her station, not with her cleverness. She had touched him with something deeper, honesty, vulnerability, and an innocence that was not naivete but courage. He allowed his mind to wander to the quiet moments he had observed, the careful balancing of trays, the way she had pressed her lips into a line at the slightest insult, the tiny shiver of hesitation before she stepped forward into the unknown. Each gesture etched itself into him, a silent map of who she was and why she mattered. And yet, he knew the danger. A rival princess had already begun to spread whispers, clever lies woven to undermine her presence, to make her falter in the court's eyes. He could not reveal his favor yet. His affection would draw scrutiny, provoke envy, and perhaps even threaten her safety. Every protective thought, every subtle act of intervention had to be precise, invisible. To act too openly was to risk the fragile bond forming between them. Kaelan rose from the chair, pacing slowly, the sound of his boots muted against the polished floors. He remembered the weight of his crown, the expectations of the court, the unyielding pressure to choose a mate among the 100 princesses vying for his hand. And yet, the choice was already clear to him. She was different. She was real. She was the only one whose presence made the pomp and pageantry meaningless. Meanwhile, somewhere in the palace, Ilara tended to a small, hidden garden. A private corner, shielded from the prying eyes of nobles, where she could breathe freely. She pressed her fingers into the soil, adjusting a wilted bloom, unaware that her small act of kindness had been witnessed from afar. Kaelan had noticed, in passing, the quiet care she gave to things overlooked, unnoticed. Her compassion for the overlooked and broken reflected the depth of her character, and it bound him further to her. He leaned against the sill of a shadowed window, gazing out over the palace grounds, thinking of the vast expectations of his lineage and the crushing loneliness that accompanied his power. A king surrounded by nobles, princes, and princesses, yet profoundly alone. And then he thought of her again. The quiet maid, the one invisible to the world, who had moved through the ballroom with dignity, resilience, and quiet fire. His lips curved in a faint, private smile, the kind no courtier would ever see. He would protect her, guide her, and, though the world would not understand, he would claim her in every way that mattered. Not with grandeur, not with spectacle, but with quiet certainty. Outside, the faint rustle of leaves in the hidden garden marked the end of the day, the approaching night. And Kaelan, alone in his chambers, allowed himself one rare indulgence. To imagine a world in which she was beside him, not as a servant, not as a shadow, but as the one who had quietly, unknowingly captured the Alpha King's heart. The ballroom was alive with music and glittering gowns, but beneath the laughter and melody, a darker current had begun to stir. Ilara moved carefully along the polished floors, her tray of drinks steady despite the tight knot in her stomach. She sensed it before she saw it, a shift in the whispers that passed through the nobles like a sudden chill. Eyes followed her, not with curiosity this time, but with intent, calculating malice. A rival princess leaned close to a cluster of courtiers, her voice smooth and sharp. "The Alpha King's favor is already diverted," she whispered, glancing subtly at Ilara. "Did you notice how he watches her? The maid. A servant, and yet, she captures his attention." Her words were venom wrapped in silk. "Do you imagine she could ever truly hold his regard?" Ilara froze for a fraction of a heartbeat, her hands tightening around the tray. She could feel the weight of every whispered syllable, the way eyes darted toward her, and the sudden, suffocating realization that she had been noticed. Not for kindness, not for courage, but as an object of envy, a target for ridicule. Her heart pounded. And then, it happened. A nobleman, with the subtle cruelty learned from years among the princesses, made a remark just loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "Careful, maid," he said, a mock bow accompanying the words. "One more slip, and the king might think you worthy of his attention." How amusing. Gasps and suppressed laughter rippled through the hall. Ilara felt every eye on her, the whispered malice thickening the air around her. She bowed slightly, hiding her face, though her cheeks burned red. Tears threatened at the edges of her eyes, the sting of humiliation sharp and immediate. She had never felt so small, so exposed. Kalen, standing at the edge of the room in his usual shadowed corner, felt the tension in his chest tighten. His control, always absolute, now chafed against the constraints of court etiquette. He could not openly defend her, not yet, not without drawing the scrutiny of the very nobles whose judgment threatened her. But he could not leave her to bear it alone. He moved subtly through the crowd, a shadow among shadows, guiding her inadvertently away from the jeering nobles. Another near collision with a careless dancer was prevented by his quiet presence, though Ilara remained unaware. She felt only the flutter of tension in the room, the dizzying mix of fear and shame, and the strange, almost imperceptible sense of being watched and protected. The rival princess noticed, of course, the way Kalen's attention lingered, invisible but palpable. Her smile curled with cunning satisfaction. "Even he cannot deny her presence," she whispered to herself, plotting the next step in her campaign to humiliate the maid publicly. Ilara retreated, not fully understanding why, her heart heavy and her hands trembling. She found a small space near the edge of the hall, where the golden light softened into shadow. She pressed the tray against her chest as if it were armor, and her breath came in shallow, uneven bursts. Shame and confusion mingled, and yet, beneath the fear, a small, stubborn ember of resilience glowed. She would endure, as she always had. Kalen watched her from a distance, calculating his next move. He could feel the shifting tides of the ballroom, the scheming, the envy, the whispers that threatened to suffocate her. He could not allow her to be crushed beneath their cruelty. And yet, he also understood the delicate balance required. One wrong step, one overt gesture, and the court would pounce. For a long moment, he simply observed, allowing himself the rare luxury of frustration and admiration at once. She moved with dignity even under attack, her strength quiet but undeniable. And though the court mocked her, and though the princesses plotted with malicious precision, Kalen's decision crystallized with absolute clarity. She would not suffer alone, and he would find a way to protect her, silently, patiently, irresistibly. As the music swelled, a new waltz calling the dancers forward, Ilara steadied herself and moved again. The whispering continued, sharper now, but the faint, unexplainable comfort of being watched persisted. Somewhere in the shadows, Kalen remained, a silent sentinel, calculating, patient, and utterly devoted to keeping her safe, even if she could not yet see it. And though the palace seemed intent on breaking her spirit, the unspoken bond between the king and the maid began to take root, a tether formed in silence, protection, and unwavering attention. A battle of whispers, schemes, and societal expectation had begun, but it would not claim her heart. Not while he remained, unseen yet unyielding, at her side. Ilara slipped through the back corridors of the palace, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpets and dim light. The murmurs of the ballroom faded behind her, replaced by the hush of shadowed hallways and the quiet hum of distant servants. She clutched the tray to her chest, though it was empty now, her hands trembling not from the weight but from the sting of humiliation still clinging to her like a second skin. The whispered words of the rival princess replayed in her mind. A maid daring to capture the Alpha King's attention. Every syllable seemed to echo louder than it should, twisting in her chest, leaving her raw and small. Her cheeks burned, and a shiver of anger mingled with shame. How could they be so cruel, so certain that a simple servant could not matter? She reached the servants' quarters, a modest room tucked away from the glittering chaos of the main hall. The familiar smell of dust, oil, and worn wood was oddly comforting, grounding her in a world where she did not have to perform or fear judgment. She set the tray down, taking a deep, shuddering breath, letting herself sink against the wall. For the first time all evening, she allowed herself to feel the hurt, the fear, and the fragile thread of longing that had begun to weave through her heart. And then, a soft note, nearly imperceptible, landed on the floor beside her. She looked down, startled, and found a folded piece of parchment, sealed with a simple wax emblem. Confused, she picked it up, her fingers brushing the edges as she broke the seal. The message was brief, written in elegant script. You are seen. You are not alone. Walk forward with courage. Kay. Her breath caught. Kay. Kaylin. The name alone, even in initial form, sent a strange warmth threading through her chest. She looked around, half expecting someone to appear in the doorway, to witness her reading it and laugh or scold. But the room remained empty, quiet except for her racing heartbeat. She sank to the floor, pressing the note against her chest. No words had been spoken aloud, yet the promise was clear. Someone powerful, someone who commanded the palace itself, had reached out, not with grandeur, not with obligation, but with quiet care. Her eyes brimmed with tears, but they were not only tears of shame. Some were tears of hope, fragile and new. Outside, the palace lights glimmered like stars reflected on glass. Somewhere in those glittering halls, Kaylin moved with careful precision, ensuring she would not be harmed, that no careless hand or cruel word could touch her again tonight. He did not intrude, did not make his presence known, yet his influence was felt in the steadiness of her steps, in the air that seemed to part gently before her, shielding her from further humiliation. Ilara pressed the parchment to her lips, whispering a quiet, uncertain gratitude. She did not understand why he had chosen her, why someone so powerful would concern himself with a lowly maid. And yet, the tether between them had grown stronger, invisible but unbreakable, formed in the quiet spaces between observation and protection. The rival princesses continued their schemes in the ballroom, their laughter and plotting faintly audible even here, yet the sting had dulled. She could sense it now, the weight of power aligned quietly beside her. Someone who saw her true self, someone who valued the courage behind her humility. A small, tender hope bloomed, fragile yet insistent. Ilara folded the note carefully, tucking it inside her bodice. She would carry it close, a secret shield against the cruelty of the night. The Alpha King had reached across the distance, silently, profoundly, and she felt, for the first time, that she might not have to endure the palace's cruelty alone. The shadows of the corridors stretched long as she rose, her steps slower now, measured with a newfound resolve. Each footfall carried a whisper of courage, a fragile confidence nurtured in secrecy. She would face the court again, she realized, because somewhere in the glittering chaos, someone was waiting, watching, protecting, silently tethered to her heart. And in that quiet moment, the slow, unspoken rhythm of their bond deepened. In the world of whispers and schemes, Ilara was no longer entirely invisible, and Kaylin's watchful presence promised that her courage would not go unnoticed, even in the shadow of danger. The ballroom glimmered under the soft glow of chandeliers, yet the opulence felt hollow to Kaylin. The laughter of nobles, the delicate rustle of silk, the polished smiles of princesses, all of it was performance, a gilded stage where every gesture was calculated to impress. And yet, in the midst of it, one presence stood apart, Ilara. She moved among the clusters of dancers and courtiers with measured steps, her tray held steady, her chest rising and falling with cautious composure. Her cheeks still bore the faint flush of earlier humiliation, but her eyes held a quiet determination that drew Kaelin's attention like a lodestone. Tonight, he would not remain entirely in the shadows. The subtle protections, the invisible guidance, had carried her through minor dangers and whispered cruelty. But now, more overt measures were necessary. He moved discreetly, a shadow with intent, ensuring that no accidental collision or malicious whisper could harm her. A careless nobleman jostled her shoulder, but Kaelin's presence shifted near enough to intercept, invisible yet undeniably felt. Ilara paused, sensing once more that strange, comforting warmth brushing against her. Her pulse quickened, a shiver of recognition threading through her nerves. She did not know why, nor yet how, but someone powerful had chosen to watch over her, to guard her from the subtle perils of court. Across the room, the princesses flitted like jeweled birds, their laughter sharpened with rivalry. One in particular, noting Kaelin's constant attention on the maid, exchanged a glance with another. Their smiles were cunning, eyes narrowed. "He favors her," one whispered, the venom masked beneath silken tones. "We cannot allow it to continue." Kaelin felt their scheming like a ripple in the air. He did not respond with confrontation, he never did, but he allowed the consequences of their ambition to unfold before him, carefully maneuvering to protect Ilara without revealing his hand too soon. A slight tilt of his body here, a faint shift in the current of his presence there, enough to prevent disaster without exposing his feelings. Ilara moved to serve a noblewoman, only to feel the brush of a hand against hers, almost imperceptible, guiding her tray into safer hands. Her heart leapt. Again, fleeting contact, yet every nerve in her body seemed electrified. She stole a glance toward the edge of the hall, searching for the source, but all she saw were blurred silhouettes, dancers twirling, nobles whispering. And yet, she knew, she could feel, it was him. Kaelin's eyes lingered on her, unwavering. No one else in the ballroom could rival his focus. The princesses, with all their polish and ambition, had nothing to claim him. Only she did, unknowingly, simply by being herself. Each falter he prevented, each insult he intercepted, was an invisible declaration. She mattered more than their schemes, more than their beauty, more than their cleverness. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the shift began to ripple through the court. The noblewomen noticed subtle interventions, the way mishaps seemed to resolve themselves, the quiet authority that seemed to guide Ilara through peril. Whispers began to change tone, curiosity threading into judgment. Who was the maid that even the Alpha King watched over so carefully? Ilara's pulse fluttered as she felt it again, the tether of protection, invisible yet undeniable. She did not yet understand him, nor his power, nor the intensity of the gaze that followed her every step. But a small, daring thought formed in her mind. Perhaps she was no longer as powerless as the court believed. Kaelin allowed himself a private, restrained smile. The slow burn of his choice was deliberate. He would not force her, would not expose her prematurely, but every step of guidance, every shadowed intervention, every quiet watch was a claim. A promise. A silent declaration that no one, not even the scheming princesses, could deny. And as the music swelled, carrying dancers across the polished floors in a glittering display, Kaelin's decision crystallized fully. He would continue to protect her, subtly and decisively, against all threats. His favor was no longer hidden, though it remained invisible to most. And in the delicate spaces between ballroom laughter and whispered schemes, a slow, undeniable bond continued to grow, unseen, unspoken, yet impossible to ignore. The music had dwindled to a distant hum, replaced by murmurs and the occasional clink of glasses. The grand hall, once alive with laughter and swirling skirts, now felt tense, a fragile hush stretched over the remaining courtiers. Ilara moved carefully, her hand steady despite the lingering unease from the previous night's whispers. But tonight, the air seemed heavier, charged with something darker, something she could not yet name. As she reached the sideboard to refresh the wine, a sudden movement caught her eye, a shadow slipping too quickly across the hall. Before she could react, a glass, poisoned or tampered with, tipped perilously on the edge of the table. Time seemed to slow. Her hand shot out instinctively, but the tray wobbled, threatening to spill its deadly contents across the floor and across her. A shadow moved faster. Kaelin emerged from the periphery of her vision, his hand catching the glass in a single, fluid motion. The world seemed to snap back into motion, the music faint again, the gasps of nearby nobles unnoticed by him. His eyes, dark and commanding, held hers for a heartbeat, a silent question and reassurance in equal measure. Ilara's heart pounded so violently she thought it might betray her fear. Her breath caught, and for a moment, the room seemed impossibly large, impossibly dangerous, and yet impossibly hers with him there. He set the glass aside, his hand lingering briefly near hers, almost brushing, almost claiming, but restrained, careful, deliberate. No one else had noticed. The princesses, still gliding across the ballroom with false smiles and gleaming eyes, were oblivious. The courtiers whispered, but none suspected the near catastrophe that had just been averted. Only Kaelin knew the danger, and only Ilara felt, faintly, the surge of protection radiating from him. She stepped back, trembling, and he inclined his head slightly. Not a word, not a gesture of alarm, only a steady, commanding presence that radiated power and care. He did not need to speak. The energy around him communicated everything. She was safe. She could breathe again. And yet, the incident left her shaken. How could someone so ordinary, so lowly, attract such danger? And why had he been there, at just the right moment? She dared to glance toward him, but he had already retreated into the shadows, calm, composed, alpha in every unspoken way. Kaelin's eyes lingered on her, even from the darkness. Every heartbeat, every slight tremor of fear in her body, only drew his attention further. He saw her fragility, yes, but also her courage, the way she had steadied the tray, the way she had not collapsed despite the terror that had washed over her. And in that courage, he found a strength worth protecting with every fiber of his being. The princesses continued their performance, their scheming smiles sharp, yet their eyes flickered occasionally toward the maid and the invisible force guarding her. Rumors, jealousy, subtle threats, none could touch her now. Kaelin's power, restrained but undeniable, had created a shield around her. Ilara's knees weakened slightly, relief washing over her in trembling waves. She realized, perhaps for the first time fully, that the presence she had felt all night was not imagination. Someone powerful had chosen her. Someone dangerous, unyielding, and completely devoted had claimed her safety, even without her knowledge. She looked toward the shadows, her chest tight with a mixture of fear and awe, and whispered the word she dared not speak aloud. "Who are you?" Kaelin, still watching silently from his hidden vantage, allowed himself a faint, private smile. Not yet. Not tonight. The moment for revelation would come, but for now, she needed to understand only one truth: she was no longer unprotected. She was no longer invisible. And as the night deepened, the bond between them solidified, not with words, not with ceremony, but with life, danger, and the quiet, undeniable knowledge that he would be there. Always. The grand hall shimmered under hundreds of flickering candles, their light bouncing off crystal chandeliers, gilded walls, and the countless polished gowns of the assembled princesses. The music had softened into a quiet, expectant hum, a prelude to the announcement that all courtiers had been anticipating. 100 princesses had competed for his hand, each seeking to dazzle, to charm, to manipulate, but none had truly captured his heart. Ilara stood at the edge of the ballroom, her hands folded nervously in front of her. She had been summoned to serve, yet she felt the weight of every gaze, not of judgment this time, but of curiosity. Whispers rustled through the crowd like restless wind. Who will he choose? Which princess has earned his favor? And then Kaelin stepped forward, his presence commanding the entire room even before a word left his lips. Every head turned, every whisper stilled. The Alpha King moved with quiet authority, his dark eyes scanning the glittering hall, not landing on the tallest, most radiant, or most practiced of the princesses, but on the small, trembling figure of the maid. A hush fell, sharp and immediate. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Ilara's heart nearly stopped. Her cheeks flushed a brilliant shade of rose. She tried to shrink back, to disappear into the shadows, but Kaelin's gaze held her in place, steady and unwavering. He took a deliberate step closer, his cloak brushing softly against the polished floor. His voice, when he spoke, was deep, resonant, and without hesitation. "I have watched the performances, the schemes, and the displays of charm." And yet, his eyes held hers, burning with a quiet, commanding intensity. None have captured my attention, my respect, or my heart. Except for one. Ilara felt as though the air had thickened around her. Her knees threatened to give way beneath her, yet she did not move. She could feel the weight of every eye in the hall upon her, the tension of 100 jealous princesses, and yet the fear that had plagued her all night began to transform into something else, astonishment, disbelief, and a fragile, shimmering hope. Kaelan stepped fully into the light now, the flicker of candle flames illuminating the sharp lines of his jaw, the commanding presence of his form. "Ilara," he said, and the single name rolled across the hall with the force of a declaration. "You will stand by my side, not as a servant, not as a shadow, but as the one I have chosen. My mate. My equal in every way that matters." A stunned silence followed. The princesses froze mid-curtsy, their smiles faltering, eyes wide with outrage and disbelief. Some mouths opened, ready to protest, to claim injustice, to argue that a maid could never deserve a king, but Kaelan's gaze swept across them, unyielding and absolute. Not a word escaped him. The authority in his posture and voice sufficed. Ilara, trembling, blinked up at him. The world felt impossibly bright, impossibly loud, and yet all she could hear was the steady, undeniable beat of her own heart and the calm, unshakable certainty in Kaelan's voice. Her hands clutched the folds of her simple dress, and she realized, with a mixture of awe and disbelief, that her life had changed in a single moment. The crowd stirred, murmurs weaving into a low hum of astonishment and envy, but Kaelan did not waver. He reached for her hand, his touch deliberate and possessive without being forceful. "Step forward," he said, and she obeyed, her heart leaping at the warmth of his hand, the strength in his grasp, the quiet assurance that no one could harm her now, not the scheming princesses, not the whispers, not even the palace itself. As they stood together, the full weight of the ballroom's gaze upon them, Ilara felt a swell of emotion. Relief, awe, love, and disbelief mingled into one powerful current. She had been hidden, belittled, ignored. But now, in the light of Kaelan's choice, she was seen, honored, and claimed. Publicly, irrevocably, undeniably. Kaelan's eyes softened as they met hers, a quiet promise reflected in the depths of his gaze. No one else mattered. The whispers of envy, the schemes, the glittering displays of ambition, all had crumbled in the wake of this simple, profound declaration. He had chosen her, and in choosing her, he had reshaped the world around them. Ilara's lips trembled as she finally found her voice, a whisper that only he could hear. "YQ, chose-me." His hand tightened around hers, and a faint, private smile curved his lips. "Always," he said, a single word that carried more weight than any proclamation, more power than any crown. And in that moment, amidst a hall of shocked nobles and plotting princesses, Ilara understood. She was no longer a maid. She was his. And nothing could undo that. The morning sun spilled through the tall palace windows, painting golden stripes across the marble floors. Ilara rose from her modest chamber bed, her hands still trembling slightly from the events of the previous night. Gone was the timid maid, the one who had cowered under whispers and mockery. In her place stood someone new, someone claimed, protected, and, above all, cherished by the Alpha King himself. Yet the world had not entirely shifted with her status. The princesses still lingered in their elegant suites, their whispers sharp and venomous, plotting how to undermine her. Courtiers watched with curious eyes, measuring every gesture, every word, as though expecting a mistake. The palace was not yet fully tamed. Her place, though publicly acknowledged, was still fragile. Kaelan entered quietly, his presence filling the room with calm authority. The Alpha King, so often a figure of distant power, now moved beside her with gentle certainty. He had chosen her publicly, yet he continued to guide her quietly, ensuring she navigated the court without fear. His hand brushed hers once, almost imperceptibly, a reminder that she was never alone, that his protection and favor were constant. Ilara took a slow, steadying breath. She reminded herself of the truth. She was seen, valued, and loved. Yet old habits die slowly. She still flinched at the whisper of a false compliment, still held herself a little too stiffly when a noblewoman's gaze lingered. Kaelan noticed, as always. Without a word, he would adjust, offering small gestures of reassurance, a soft look, a guiding hand, a presence that whispered, "You are safe, you belong." Days passed, and with each, Ilara learned to carry herself differently. She walked the halls with quiet confidence, her eyes lifting to meet those of courtiers who once scorned her. Some bowed stiffly, others murmured apologies, and a few scheming princesses scowled at the unspoken power that tethered her to the Alpha King. None could deny the bond, none could diminish it. Kaelin remained a constant, though never overwhelming. He offered gentle guidance during council meetings, subtle protection when the princess's jealousy flared, and quiet moments of connection when the weight of the palace pressed too heavily on her. Each day, Ilara felt her courage grow, her confidence deepening as she realized she was no longer just surviving, she was thriving. One afternoon, as sunlight filtered through the high windows, Kaelin drew her aside to a quiet balcony overlooking the palace gardens. The world beyond shimmered with life and possibility. He reached for her hand, the touch light but grounding. "You have done well," he murmured, his voice low, almost a whisper meant only for her. "The palace will continue to test you, but you are stronger than they know. Stronger than even you believe." Ilara felt warmth spread through her chest, a mixture of relief, pride, and the lingering, unspoken affection that had grown between them. I'm trying," she admitted softly, her eyes tracing the contours of his face, memorizing the calm strength in his gaze. Kaelin's thumb brushed lightly over her knuckles. "You need not try for me," he said simply. "I see you. All of you. And that is enough." In that moment, the palace, with all its whispers, envy, and expectation, seemed to fade. Ilara realized that her journey was not just about surviving cruelty or winning favor. It was about healing, about learning to accept herself, and about trusting the Alpha who had chosen her, completely and irrevocably. The princesses would scheme, the courtiers would murmur, and challenges would arise. But Ilara no longer feared them. She had her place, her protector, and a bond that was unshakable. Slowly, deliberately, she began to walk the halls with her head held high, a quiet but undeniable presence in the court. And Kaelin, ever silent in his watchfulness, allowed himself the rare smile, knowing that the slow burn of trust and affection between them had blossomed into something enduring. Their connection, forged in secrecy, danger, and subtle care, was now a quiet but unbreakable force in a palace that had once seemed impossible to navigate. Ilara's heart swelled with an understanding she had never dared to imagine. She was no longer a maid, no longer invisible, no longer uncertain. She was chosen. She was protected. And most of all, she was loved. The palace had quieted for the night. The chandeliers were dimmed, their golden glow soft against the darkened corridors, and the echoes of the day's ceremonies faded into a hushed stillness. Ilara lingered in her chamber, her hands trembling slightly as she smoothed the folds of her gown. She had grown accustomed to the eyes of the court, to the whispers and cautious admiration, but now, with the night stretching before her, she felt a different kind of anticipation, a private, unspoken tension that had nothing to do with status or ceremony. Kaelin appeared at the doorway, his presence filling the room without a sound. The Alpha King, so often a figure of authority and command, moved now with deliberate gentleness, his dark eyes softened by the candlelight. There was no audience here, no scheming nobles or jealous princesses, only them. And in this quiet, the invisible tether between them seemed to pulse stronger, drawing them together with an unspoken gravity. "Ilara," he murmured, his voice low, resonant, carrying a depth of feeling that made her chest tighten. "Are you comfortable?" She looked up at him, her heart fluttering like a bird trapped in her ribcage. Comfortable. The word felt almost impossible, given all that had happened in the palace, all the schemes and whispers, all the public scrutiny. And yet, with him here, so near, she realized she could finally breathe without fear. I think so," she whispered, her fingers brushing nervously against her gown. "With you, yes, I think I am." Kaelin stepped closer, closing the space between them with a controlled, measured grace. He extended his hand, inviting, patient. She took it, trembling slightly at the warmth of his touch, the strength behind it, the quiet promise that she was safe and cherished. "You have endured so much," he said softly, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "And yet, you remain steadfast. Courageous. Entirely yourself." Ilara's gaze met his, and she felt a wave of emotion, relief, awe, love, and something tender, delicate, and unspoken, threading through her heart. I never expected this, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. To be seen, truly seen, by someone like you. Kaelin's lips curved in a faint, private smile, a rare vulnerability slipping through the mask of the Alpha King. You deserve to be seen, Elara, he said, his eyes searching hers. Not for your station, not for your appearance, but for who you are. And I chose you, completely. Quietly, perhaps, but without hesitation. A shiver of warmth spread through her chest. She had dreamed of such words, imagined them in stolen moments, but hearing them now, spoken with such intent, made her heart leap. Slowly, deliberately, he took her hand and drew her closer. Not with force, but with the quiet command of someone who understood the fragility of trust and the sanctity of consent. They moved together, side by side, across the chamber, until they stood near the balcony that overlooked the moonlit gardens. The night air drifted in, cool and fragrant, carrying the scent of roses and jasmine. She leaned slightly into him, and he adjusted, his presence encircling her like a shield, protective and unwavering. For a long, suspended moment, they simply stood there, hands intertwined, hearts echoing in rhythm, the world reduced to the quiet intimacy of their shared presence. Words were unnecessary. Every glance, every subtle gesture conveyed what the court, the schemes, and the titles could not. Finally, she whispered, a tremor in her voice. I trust you. Kaelin's thumb traced her knuckles once more, deliberate and slow. And I will never betray that trust, he said, a vow that carried weight heavier than any crown. Not for the court, not for the palace, not for anyone or anything. You are mine, Elara. And I am yours. The words, though softly spoken, carried a power that reverberated through her very soul. Tears pricked at her eyes, not of sorrow but of relief and overwhelming emotion. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel the depth of her love, the safety of his protection, the affirmation of her worth. Kaelin stepped closer, his forehead resting lightly against hers, his breath mingling with hers. She closed her eyes, letting the moment envelop her, letting the slow, steady beat of his heart become her anchor. No grand gestures, no public proclamations. Just this quiet, private affirmation of their bond. The Alpha King and the Maid, now mates, standing together in a world that had once sought to belittle her. And in the silence, she realized that she had found more than love. She had found belonging, trust, and the quiet promise of forever. Morning broke over the palace with a gentle hush, the first rays of sunlight spilling over gilded roofs and through the tall windows of the grand halls. The courtyard sparkled with dew, and the gardens smelled of fresh roses and jasmine, the air carrying a promise of beginnings. Elara stood at the balcony, her hands resting lightly on the carved stone railing, breathing in the calm after days of chaos, scheming, and tension. The palace, once a maze of whispers, jealous glances, and subtle threats, now felt different. She no longer moved as the timid maid who had served quietly in the shadows. She was no longer defined by a tray or a whispered insult. She was the chosen, the protected, the mate of the Alpha King, and the palace could no longer deny her place. Kaelin appeared beside her, silent and steady as always, his presence grounding and reassuring. He had risen with the dawn, not to declare his dominance or status, but to simply be with her, to share the quiet triumph of the night and the promise of the day. His hand brushed hers, light but deliberate, a gentle tether that spoke volumes. The palace seems different this morning, Elara whispered, a soft smile touching her lips. The courtiers, the princesses, they all look at me differently now. Kaelin's gaze followed hers, sweeping across the bustling courtyard below. They do, he said, his voice calm, deep, yet threaded with pride. And yet, you have not changed. You remain yourself. That is why they cannot undermine you, why no amount of whispers can harm you. Your strength, your courage, and your heart, those are unshakable. And they are seen. By me. By everyone who matters. Elara's heart swelled. The journey had been long, each day a test of courage, patience, and resilience. She had faced humiliation, danger, and jealousy. But now, with Kaelin by her side, she felt whole. The invisible threads of protection, trust, and love had finally woven her into the palace in a way no title or wealth could achieve. The princesses, still plotting and whispering behind closed doors, could not touch the bond she shared with Kaelin. He had claimed her publicly, yes, but more importantly, he had chosen her privately, consistently, with his unwavering presence, his subtle interventions, and his gentle care. That choice could not be undone. It had been cemented in trust, courage, and love. Kaelin turned to her fully, eyes soft yet commanding, the weight of his alpha presence filling the space without need for words. "This is our beginning," he said quietly, pressing a kiss to the back of her hand. "The palace, the world outside, it will always test us. But together, we are stronger than anything they can muster." Ilara leaned into him, resting her head lightly against his shoulder. She felt the steady, powerful rhythm of his heart beneath her ear, a comfort and a promise. "Together," she echoed, her voice carrying both certainty and relief. Below, the palace stirred, unaware that a quiet revolution had occurred. The maid who had once been overlooked now walked in confidence. She was no longer a shadow in the corners. She was a force of grace, courage, and rightful claim. And beside her, the Alpha King, steady, protective, and devoted, would always ensure that she remained seen, valued, and loved. The morning light deepened, spilling warmth across the balcony and the palace gardens. Ilara allowed herself a full, unrestrained breath, a sigh of relief and triumph. The trials were behind her, the whispers muted, the schemers powerless. She had survived, endured, and emerged stronger. And now, in the quiet dawn, she understood fully. Her life had changed forever. Not because of titles, wealth, or appearance, but because of courage, resilience, and a love that had chosen her, steadfast and unwavering. The palace, with all its opulence and intrigue, had been transformed by a single truth. Justice, loyalty, and love would always prevail. And as she stood there, hand in hand with Kaelin, the first light of a new day illuminated more than just the gardens below. It illuminated the beginning of their life together, united, unshakable, and ready for whatever challenges the future might bring.